welcome back to the Czech Museum. This has been a really fun experiment for the past couple of years. I'm really grateful that Robert has continued to do this book club with us and help lead this conversation, because it's really shed some light on some interesting novels. I'm sure you guys have, I hope, strong opinions and are willing to share them regarding this book. Texas celebrates Czech Heritage Month in October, which means that there's a lot going on. We do a lot in general, but there's particularly a good amount. And we have a number of free events that happen in October, and we're very happy for them. The big one that I'm going to push right now is the October 29th concert that we have here with the Apollo Chamber Players. This is the 9th year that we've worked with them. And this year they happen to be America's chamber music group. They won that title. So we're lucky to be able to have them come back and have that performance. But today we are talking about Hrabal and All My Cats. And who doesn't love talking about cats, right? So I'm gonna turn it over to Robert, and hopefully we have a really nice, stimulating discussion here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johanna. And, my job here is not to lecture. That was my previous job, but maybe to moderate the discussion, to open it up, to add a little fuel to the discussion. So what I thought I would do was frame the book a little bit, because it's about all my cats. But it's about more than cats. I think we'll easily come to a consensus about that. It's certainly a book about cats, as the cover suggests. But you get cat plus from this text. And so I thought I would triangulate this short, funny, wonderful, and disturbing book by Hrabal. Memoir, fiction, faction. You may have opinions of exactly what kind of book this is. I think it's kind of hard to classify. I suppose if you're working in a bookstore, you'd have to put it under nonfiction and memoir. But I myself am wondering, to what extent is there a little bit of shaping going on? Because, and I think this is true going all the way back to our conversation on I Serve the King of England. Hrabal is famously a kind of barroom raconteur, and he mixes the high and the low, and he mixes the formal and the casual. And I think at first glance, and I think we may have seen this also in our last discussion if you were here for closely watched trains, he can come across as being quite a casual writer. A storyteller, very fond of the anecdote, but I think he's a very shrewd writer, and I think he's a very cunning writer, and I think he's a very designing writer in all senses of the word. So yes, this is his tribute to his cats, but I think it's so much more than being just a memoir about being a pet owner at a certain phase in his life. So I thought I'd frame this or triangulate this by giving it as a couple of companions, two other quotes. And for the first quote, we're going to do a callback, as they would say in the world of comedy, back to our last season of the Czech Book Club, and back to the world and the strong opinions of Milan Kundera. So we read several of his novels, and Kundera in 1986 published a book called The Art of the Novel, made up of various essays and interviews. And in one of those interviews, which is called Dialogue on the Art of the Novel, he has this to say, and I'm not really going to comment on why I chose it. I just thought maybe it could be there alongside the Hrabal. Historiography, says Kundera, writes the history of society, not of man. That is why the historical events my novels talk about are often forgotten by historiography. Example, in the years that followed the 1968 Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia, the reign of terror against the public was preceded by officially organized massacres of dogs, not cats, dogs. An episode totally forgotten and without importance for a historian, for a political scientist, but of the utmost anthropological significance. By this one episode alone, I suggested the historical climate of The Farewell Party, which was a novel that Kundera published in the mid-1970s. So that's one. That's from a writer that most of us know. This next prompt is from a writer that perhaps only I know. So this is from the Irish poet and professor Justin Quinn, who's one of my oldest friends and who has lived in Prague and taught at Charles University and translated from Czech for many years, decades now. And I'm not Czech, but I count myself lucky to be Czech adjacent, not only through this wonderful organization, but mainly through my long friendship with Justin Quinn and his wife, who's also a writer, Teresa Limanova. And also, Justin's been to Houston. He was the best man at our wedding back in the day. And this is an essay that he wrote 20 years ago for a magazine called the Dublin Review, a quarterly. And it's an essay where he and his poet friend Joseph are hiking through what used to be the Sudetenlands in Bohemia and going to visit, haunting sites like abandoned German community graveyards. And it's an essay called Land Clearance. But he gives you the backstory in the course of this essay. After the Treaty of Saint-Germain in 1919, which helped to dismantle the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Sudetens found themselves in the new Republic of Czechoslovakia. In the larger towns, these communities had developed successful industries, but their markets disappeared with the empire. And as a result, Sudeten unemployment rose alarmingly in the period between the wars. As the 1930s progressed, the Sudetens looked with increasing envy to the economic prosperity of Hitler's Germany, not realizing that this success was achieved in part because German industry had lost a tough competitor in the Sudetens. The Czechoslovak government, more interested in pumping money into industrially backward areas of Slovakia, deliberately overlooked Sudeten social problems. It is little wonder then that these communities were drawn to Hitler's dream of a greater Germany that would stretch across the length and breadth of Europe. Instead of being second-class citizens of a small nation, they would become Aryan masters whose empire would last for 1,000 years. One more paragraph from Justin. When the war ended, when the Second World War ended, almost all the Sudetens were removed forcibly from Czechoslovakia. Some were murdered in massacres organized by the Czechs. About 7 kilometers away from where we are today on our hike, the bodies of 763 people were exhumed in 1947 from a pheasantry beside the town of Postolopotri. The government inquiry that ordered the exhumation led nowhere. and the communist state which established itself the next year was intent on erasing all trace of the Sudetens from the record. In other areas, especially northeast Bohemia, I've seen large dilapidated buildings that have no connection, architectural or otherwise, with the surrounding town. In many cases, they were part of factories or office complexes that have been demolished. They stand there as marks of a community and a distinctive economic life that have since disappeared from the region. Communism also left many derelict buildings in its wake, and occasionally it's difficult to distinguish one ruin from another. But for the most part, the buildings of the Sudetens still display a 19th century elegance that is in contrast to the bargain basement modernism that the communists favored. Well, there we go. Justin Quinn of Dublin and Milan Kundera of Brno. And not a cat to be seen. I mean, I think, again, this is the Hrabal experience. You start to read something which seems quite casual, quite anecdotal, but you realize that he's got an incredible literary power. Is Hrabal one of these artists, I wonder, who is that rare combination, very popular and very brilliant? I think like Vivaldi. Everybody loves Vivaldi. Vivaldi is also a musical genius. Genius is not always popular, and the popular is not always genius. But Hrabal, I think, is a very interesting case. I think another way of putting this would be, if this book is about more than cats, all my trials with cats, as he says at one point, what is going on? What is this book about? It's a what, sorry? Guilt. It's shot through with guilt, yeah. Yeah.
Then I can think of Hrabal and his cats, which is a different situation, which I actually can relate very easily because my own father was always picking up stray dogs.
Yeah.
He would keep them and they would multiply. Eventually, and he had to draw puppets that came out of this multiplication. And he was telling me how horribly he felt after that. And he couldn't forgive himself, didn't know what to do. Because everybody would ask, well, why don't you just fix these cats? But it's a little bit different time, I guess, a different attitude. It's people, including my father, who consider something so intrusive into anyone's life as to take that to the better. It's just part of life. So they have to live with it.
And it's one of the, I think, one of the most powerful paradoxes in the book, that the person who is most compassionate when it comes to animals ends up feeling the most guilt, an overpowering guilt. I mean, this book goes to very, very dark places. And again, you may be thinking, are we still talking about cats here? Is this still, this is very far from All Creatures Great and Small and the usual kind of good vibes you get from memoirs about looking after animals. So the person who is, the most tenderhearted also turns out to do some of the most brutal things in the book. But then again, you talked about what his wife says, and I think this is one of the really genius moves artistically in the book, is that it just starts with that very understandable, repeated question: what are we going to do with all these cats? But by the end of the book, that becomes almost like a chorus from Greek tragedy. I think he's so designing, he sets up these little motifs and so cleverly brings them back again and again to provide what could be, I think, a rather loose little memoir of 100 pages. It actually has a lot of form, it has a lot of structure. This is a story that takes place, it appears to be in the early 1980s. And he wrote the book, he published the book in Czech in 1986. And
He does make reference to other massacres.
he does, because there's a certain point where it stops being indirect, and then it's absolutely direct. For example, by the time you reach page 27, you can't really ignore it. Here's a paragraph that I think this is one of the points where I thought, no, I'm not just imagining this. This really is part of the burden that's on his shoulders. I'm looking at the paragraph that begins at the very end of page 26. And then I picked up a spade, and in an out-of-the-way place among a stand of birch trees. By the way, do you know that Auschwitz translates into the rather more innocent English place name of Birchwood? Out of the way place among a stand of birch trees, I dug a deep pit into which I dumped the damp contents of the sack. But then I couldn't help myself, and I ran back to my cottage and picked 6 geraniums. And when I got back, I threw those flowers into the grave. The kittens were lying there in a terrifying mishmash, and I felt a growing sense of alarm. I should not have looked down, because those kittens were lying there like images from Nazi mass graves. So that's the point where it's out in the open. And towards the end of the book, and Alice, the last time, showed some of us pictures. She visited the property at Kersko. So I kept on imagining that place. And I thought, up until that point in the book, there's been these suggestions lurking in the woods, kind of at the edge of the property line. That's where they cross over. And clearly, history and the horrors of history are directly trespassing into the book. With the Holocaust, or with any kind of, genocidal crime, one has to be very careful. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of, for example, the book called, and I think it was turned into a movie, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. Particularly people who didn't have a kind of direct experience or lived through the war, or lived through the Holocaust, there is, it's a question of maybe taste and appropriateness. Sometimes, it can be poor judgment on the part of the writer to bring in the Holocaust or bring in other horrors of history, yeah. Historiography, kind of official history, yeah. I mean, my own personal feeling is that Hrabal, having lived through that century right in the heart of Europe, literally being born in 1914, where the outbreak of the Great War, he's earned it, whereas somebody, and that boy with the striped pajamas was an Irish writer with no real connection with those places and with the history, and he was in fact criticized by the Holocaust Museum at Auschwitz for not really understanding the history. For example, in that book, they said it's such a trivial account of the Holocaust that the writer in that case, I don't want to beat up on this writer, but it just comes to mind as an example. There wouldn't have been boys in striped pajamas because at Auschwitz, the children were almost always killed straight away. So that there can be responsible and irresponsible literary uses of something like the Holocaust. I'm getting the sense that people thought that it was justified and authentic, the way that he pulls in those imageries from the other horrors.
It's his lived experience.
Yeah. And part of the lived experience is that, it's not the only crime that I think that, or kind of mass crime that he's talking about. The reason, what made me think of, let me go to my notes here, 42. The reason that I remembered Justin's essay, which I hadn't read in several years, when I got to page 42. Because talking about burden, talking about guilt, which is, one of the most important themes of the text. Hrabal, as a Czech civilian, can't be responsible or guilty for the Holocaust, though he's lived through that blood-drenched century, starting with the Great War. But I think he's referring to more than just the crimes of the Nazi regime on page 42. This is the one complete paragraph on that page. But I didn't want to hang myself. Talk about a sense of guilt and self-accusation. I wanted to be in the world. There were still things I wanted to write, even if it were only this indictment. There's that language of judgment again, about how I betrayed my tomcat, Renda, just as I had his mother, and how I was now suffering terrible pangs of guilt for what I had done to those cats. On such mornings, when I was racked with self-loathing, I imagined that all those who had taken part in wars and had killed millions of innocent people must have suffered from such self-loathing. Well, I think to mind something that Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, said in an interview, very often the perpetrators had no sense of guilt and got on with their lives, whereas the survivors were the ones who were burdened. And a similar sense of reproach must have plagued all those who had expelled millions of people from their homes and their lands. Well, it wasn't just Hitler and Stalin who had expelled millions of people and indulged in ethnic cleansing. This is what made me think of the Sudetenans. And I wonder if you think maybe I'm making too much of a connection with it. Is he, as a Czech writer, Czech citizen, Czech intellectual, is he also burdened with the sense of the sins of his own nation? And also the communist regime, which he made a kind of peace with, Hrabal. He was other Czech writers did criticize him for making a kind of accommodation. He was not a sort of resolute dissident a la Václav Havel.
Yeah,
Is there a kind of personal guilt coming out here, or a kind of national guilt, more than just a kind of existential, all-pervasive human guilt coming out here?
I think there's a little blurb in there about the quote-unquote trial.
Yeah.
The neighbor was a little bit of a condemnation of the system.
Yeah.
It wasn't laudatory by any means. I thought it was, in a way, knocking it, not really obviously, but maybe so we get through censors, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I didn't pick up anything on sedation.
Is it possible, imagine yourself back in the 1980s, and already he's about to turn 70, right? These events are taking place in the early 1980s, and he's been through the First World War, the Second World War, the expulsion of the Sudetans, the rise of the coup that brought the communists to power. He's been through very, very difficult decades in which he was at first very oppressed by the communist authorities. He was censored. He was banned from being published. He had a kind of nervous breakdown around 1969 when he was put under surveillance. And then in the 1970s, as I heard a Czech writer say to me, he became a kind of pet of the regime. He was allowed to publish and he was given a certain amount of freedom. And he certainly made an accommodation with the regime that other Czech writers did not. Those of you who are Slavic readers would probably have picked up on this faster than I did, but I don't know if it's the same in Czech or Slovakian, but in Russian, Raskolnikov, the root of it is schism. He's the schisms, he's the split man. And I think in many ways, Hrabal, this is such an incredible self-portrait. He's such a fractured, such a split man, either between, the tender-hearted cat owner who indulges in the crazy hour. I love the crazy hour. I think every house should have a crazy hour. The crazy hour, and then with that awful mail sack, which, is so foreboding. And talking of
Or even between city and country.
Absolutely, that's fascinating. Yeah, he's going, as my mother would say, back and forth like a yo-yo between the city and the country, and he can't really abide in other places.
He's not happy at any place he is. He's in the city, he wants the country.
Absolutely. And he goes through that kind of pseudo-happy period where he buys himself a transport ticket and just rides the streetcars all day. And that's really no solution either. So this prompts actually another question I had in my notes, which is that Russian word, raskol, meaning a schism. I remember back in my lecturing days, that referred to a particular schism in the Russian Orthodox Church. And I did notice also that this text was shot through with religious language. Made a little list: soul, hell, lament, salvation, communion, sacrifice, sin, praying, absolution. Now, is that just a kind of rhetorical motif, or do you think this book has religious implications? Bug or a feature, as our friends in Silicon Valley would say?
Because I think that it argues that suffering has a redemptive quality,
Yeah.
and he's not okay with what he did until the car accident, until it's done to him. He's in that khaki car.
Ah, that's really interesting. Okay, because that leads me on to another question. I think there's two really, really striking scenes towards the end, and one is the accident. Now, what did you make of that? I mean, it literally, as he says, comes out of the blue because they hit this wall of blue and it turns out to be an 18-wheeler. He describes it as this, happy day, fortunate catharsis. Did you find it to be cathartic, or did it leave you even more disturbed that he was having such a jolly reaction to almost getting killed and ending up upside down? I'm sure his wife probably was not as enamored as having that severe car accident. The accident is another strange turn in this tale.
It's the way it's placed. I mean, I've no doubt that he actually was in an
Yeah.
accident. But it's just the way it's placed in the book. It just comes out of nowhere all of a sudden. And specifically, when he's talking later, talks about that guy in the bar. He says 20 years later, they took some glass out of his forehead.
Yeah, just yesterday a bit popped out. Yeah.
So, again, I think it all happened, but the way he placed it in the book, very interesting.
Yeah. And again, I wonder, is there a certain shaping? Is there a certain design going on? Does that really matter?
I'm sure he shaped it. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
He took various incidents and put them in maybe a different order.
Yeah.
But
I think it's really interesting you say, I mean, its position in the narrative matters a lot. And literature is not very good at dealing with kind of just the random, messy stuff that happens. You know, we're not like in a tragedy, somebody's not going to overturn a chariot, you know, like maybe it, you know, didn't need to happen if they'd been paying more attention. You know, we're so used in reading stories in the classics that everything is inevitable and it's fate and it's destiny. And if it's not, well, then character's destiny. And there's a certain necessity associated with big, violent things that happen, particularly towards the end of stories as we kind of reach a crescendo. This happens, and maybe even more than the drama of that topsy-turvy car accident, is his reception of it, where he's thinking of it as a fortunate turn of events, a kind of salvation.
I like these musical references. It does with like the
Yeah.
it was referring to particular pieces of music and the culmination of a symphony, and that would mean that for him it was like a culmination of a symphony is basically inevitable. So from this standpoint, you would expect that it was a total random event, but as if he was expecting that something like this must happen.
That's really interesting because something that is so designed, something that is so engineered, like a painting, and he makes a lot of references to his favorite painters, a symphony, a book, a play, you know, the little god, the artist, can decide what's going to happen and can provide a kind of solution or compensation for people suffering. But we know that life doesn't give us that, you know. Life is accidental, contingent, it's messy. He seemed, or at least on the surface, he seemed very, very content with his cathartic accident. I was less satisfied. You know, to me, it felt like a kind of disturbing pseudo-resolution. I think this is a really startling comparison that he makes, that, you know, maybe Hrabal would have been quite happy that if his career had ended in a sort of dramatic smash like that, as opposed to what we're left with was wondering eternally, you know, did he fall out of that hospital window feeding the birds, or did he jump? And that conversation's never going to be over. But, you know, he's almost saying, like, I wish I could have gone out with a bang like Jackson Pollock. But he does something very interesting with Jackson Pollock here. Because as far as I remember, this is not exactly how Jackson Pollock died. Yeah. I'm remembering this from reading about Jackson Pollock, and there's also a really good biopic with Ed Harris as Jackson Pollock, which he spent years making. My beloved Jackson Pollock, my master of action painting, of dripping, a painter who, when he had created the most beautiful works I had ever seen, when he had drunk cisterns of whiskey and smoked enough Pall Malls to stretch around the earth, He is so droll, Hrabal. He had dinner in the Cedar Tavern and drove off in his car, only to experience in body and all his soul what my own fate had tried unsuccessfully to accomplish with me. He crashed and died instantly. Well, he did, but he also killed a young woman who was with him, who was terrified that he was speeding. And I think another young woman was seriously injured in that crash. And I don't think he left the famous Cedar Tavern, which was Jackson Pollock and the abstract expression of their, what is the Tiger Tavern? What is the famous Prague pub that he, the Golden Tiger, yeah. He didn't leave the New York equivalent of the Golden Tiger. I think he was out on Long Island. And it was a horrifying and very messy end for, it was a kind of suicidal action on the part of Jackson Pollock, but he ended a young person's life alongside him. So I think what he's done here is he's romanticized Jackson Pollock's death, which is another way in which perhaps it falls short of for me, of being the resolution that perhaps he thinks it is. And maybe that's why it's not really the end of the book either, because we have this epilogue. Because the two extraordinary scenes towards the end, one is the accident, and the other is the swan. How about this? What do you make of the fact that this book, which is so obsessively about all his cats, ends with the swan? Nobody ever expects the Spanish Inquisition, if you remember from Monty Python, and we weren't expecting the astonishing frozen swan. Did it work for you? Or were you feeling, oh no, I really wanted to go out with another crazy hour with final chorus of cats?
That was one of those things that I thought was possible. But as you so pointed out, he put it there.
Yeah.
So it could have happened as a kid.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
It was put there, right there. But the other thing is, it could have been totally imaginary, because I can't imagine a swan getting frozen.
I can imagine a swan being that aggressive. I mean,
Yeah.
swans are,
They are.
famously, you need to avoid a swan. And
If you take it for his work, that was the theme where he was killing cats that desperately wanted to live, and here there was a swan which desperately didn't want to be rescued. That seemed to be what, say, on the surface, that's what it says directly.
let's take a look at page 93, because it ends with this just astonishing image, which is when he goes back out in the morning and what he feared would happen has happened. I mean, of course, it's so heartbreaking because I presume, I don't have the insight into a mind of a swan like Hrabal does, but instinctively the swan must have thought, this human creature wants to do me even more harm. The swan's not going to intellectually understand. He's trying to help. But when the sun came up over the frozen water, there, 3 yards from the bank, was a gentle mound of snow. And when I took a closer look, I saw that my swan, lay under it, and that before her heart had frozen, she'd been able to position her neck in a graceful arc, tuck her head under her wing. Extraordinary image. And now, covered with drifting snow, she lay there like a beautiful sculpture. And my heart felt shame at the sight, her neck and head covered by her airy wing, so that they made an arch, a mystical unity, as human hands do when they come together in prayer. The funny thing about the swan is, it's certainly dead, but it's now aesthetically perfect because of that last gesture it's made. I mean, it's a very beautiful, geometrically perfect aesthetic object. But it's also going to live forever because it's in the closing pages of this book. Here's a note I wrote to myself a couple of days ago, and either we can nod in agreement or laugh at Thursday Cremins, Saturday Cremins will say maybe this is far-fetched. But what I wrote down was frozen swan as emblem of the book itself. Because all my cats, there's a lot of dead cats, and yet they live here. It's one of the paradoxes of any work of art, All My Cats is the English title. And I noticed in some of the other translations into Spanish, etc., it's called My Cat Autíčko. But in the original Czech, 1986, it's just called Autíčko. So it's named after that one cat, not all the cats, but one cat. So chapter 6, which is about specifically the life and death of little car, Autíčko, much more, fun-colored car, the original car. That's kind of like the title story. And I think it's really interesting. We've talked about this with other books in this club, going back to Milan Kundera. What perhaps we're losing or what we're gaining by the change in by the change in title. I mean, there was a wonderful observation last time that in fact, it's not closely watched trains in the original Czech. It's like trains under very close surveillance. It's not the joke, it's really humor. So I'm wondering, what difference do you think it would make to your reading or your reflection on the book if they'd just gone with the original Czech title or the Spanish variation of it, My Cat Autíčko, that it would have been a single kitty that had been named after, not all the panoply of cats?
Honestly, somehow intuitively I thought that it is related to the fact that he got almost killed by the car that he liked, his sport escort.
Yeah.
Was his car. So that it was like a prophecy that his favorite cat of him was called Little Car.
So there is a kind of poetic justice then in that the other car is what almost ends his life. And also, as John was saying, that back and forth between Kersko and Prague is such an important dynamic in the book, never being able to enjoy the perfect life that all his friends think, you're so lucky you got that place in the country, you can ride all day, not a care in the world.
But, I have another American reference here as we were talking about like Russian references. Like for me, it was like if Toro was oscillating between his lake and Boston.
Yeah.
And here you got a guy oscillating between like a crowded city center of Prague with all these bars and tourists, and Kersko, which is like a village in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, perhaps we could have done with some of Hrabal's candor and full disclosure from Thoreau, because apparently, even though when he was out in the wilderness, he was bringing his laundry home for his mom to do every week. So that kind of ruins the romanticism of it a little bit. That's one of the parallels I think I've made before in this space between the Czechs and my people, the Irish. Again, small country, usually dominated by a very large neighbor, and humor is usually one of the only weapons to hand that can be used. I still think Crazy Hour is a wonderfully comic moment, and I think you get a great sense of Hrabal's personality there. He's so gruff, but he's so indulgent at the same time. He's complaining, but he's loving every moment of it. I was actually talking to my cat as quite frequently as I read this, And I was like, how about like a crazy 15 minutes or something like that? You're not as fun as these Czech cats. And he was decidedly unimpressed when I said these things. Shall we wrap it up? Yeah. Thank you so much. This is such a great turnout and such a great conversation. I hope we can do it again sometime.
So like I said at the beginning, we've got a number of different events that are happening throughout October. And also, I would be remiss not to tell you about our Christmas market that happens on the 6th of December. And there are a ton of different initiatives that we have, but this has been very different and fun.
I've enjoyed it. Yeah.
And I mean, I certainly have enjoyed it. I think a number of us had. So if you all have your favorite Czech author who you would like to explore next year, please send us an email. You can just go right through the website. We haven't picked one yet, but I would like to be able to do this. So
Me too.
thank you very
Thank
much. Our third floor, we recently reopened it. If you haven't seen it, you're welcome to go up and check it out. Otherwise, I hope to see you here soon.